The first thing that pierced the solemn quiet of my own prepared heart, as my gaze swept across the familiar faces gathered in the front pews, was an abrupt, almost violent conviction. I would have to call the authorities on her parents after Mass. It was not a gentle thought, but a sharp, unwelcome intrusion into the sacred space of my pastoral duties, demanding immediate and drastic action. A cold knot tightened in my stomach, a premonition that felt less spiritual and more a stark human alarm. I am a priest, not a physician, certainly no expert in the delicate machinery of the human body, but even my untrained eyes could discern the profound, desperate illness that clung to the girl. She was a tiny, fragile thing, barely a wisp, her small frame utterly dwarfed, almost swallowed, by the plush, oversized fabric of the pew. It was as if she were adrift in a vast, indifferent sea, her life force ebbing with each barely perceptible breath. Her skin, stretched tight across the delicate architecture of her face, held the lifeless hue of old parchment, almost translucent, revealing the faint tracery of veins beneath. Her lips, a pale, almost bluish line, seemed perpetually parted in a silent gasp, her breathing so shallow, so quick, so terribly precarious, that I found myself holding my own breath in a fearful empathy, half expecting each rapid intake to be her very last. A faint, rhythmic beep, 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 issued from a small, starkly clinical medical pack at her side, a jarring mechanical pulse that seemed to count down the precious moments of her fading vitality, a stark intrusion into the hushed reverence of the sanctuary. To bring a child in such an advanced state of visible suffering, so acutely vulnerable, into a public gathering, a space filled with the murmurs of many voices and the unseen currents of passing germs, felt less like an act of profound faith and more like a criminal act of desperation. It was a last reckless gamble, I concluded, one that defied every instinct for safety, every principle of responsible care, and certainly every shred of medical sense that I or any reasonable person possessed. It struck me not as piety, but as an almost reckless abandon, a flagrant disregard for her fragile life. My right hand, which had been poised almost instinctively to trace the ancient sign of the cross and begin the introit, froze mid-air, suspended in a gesture of abortive benediction. A chill, more profound than the morning's crisp air, seemed to seep into the very stones of the church, raising goosebumps along my forearms beneath the alb. The sanctuary, usually a haven of solemn comfort, a warm embrace of hallowed peace where generations had found solace, suddenly felt vast and impersonal, almost hostile in its unyielding silence, mirroring the sudden freeze in my own spirit. Outside, a bright, deceptively cheerful morning sun, filtering through the vibrant hues of our stained glass windows, depicting the joyful mysteries of the rosary, cast dancing patterns of sapphire and ruby across the nave. Yet where these luminous patches fell upon the little girl, they seemed only to cruelly accentuate the terrible pallor of her face, the almost translucent quality of her skin. The light meant to uplift, instead mercilessly illuminated the faint network of tubes and wires barely visible beneath the high collar of her dress, a garment clearly chosen for comfort but far too large, hanging loosely on her emaciated form. She was a ghost, a wisp of a child, a breath away from oblivion, held upright in the cavernous pew only by the tender, trembling hands of her mother. The woman's face, usually bright and full of gentle humor, was now a mask of gaunt exhaustion, etched with lines of worry so deep they seemed carved into her very soul. Her eyes hollow, fixed on some unseen point beyond the altar. The small portable medical device at her side continued its low, insistent hum, its tiny green and red lights blinking with a methodical, cold logic, utterly indifferent to the sacred surroundings. And then that insidious, rhythmic beep, beep, beep again, a sound utterly alien. A clinical intrusion that cut through the profound quiet of the church, a jarring counterpoint to the quiet reverence I so diligently sought to cultivate. This wasn't a child seeking comfort in the embrace of God's house, I thought with a tightening in my chest. This was a child being wheeled, quite literally, to the precipice of eternity, and her parents, I was certain, were tragically, misguidedly leading the way. The very air seemed to thicken with the unspoken implications of their presence. The sheer audacity of it, the raw, public display of such profound vulnerability, left me momentarily speechless. A knot formed in my throat, dry and tight, and the opening words of the Mass, the familiar cadences of the ancient rite, seemed to catch, unable to form on my tongue. My mind, usually a quiet harbor of prayer and focus during the sacred liturgy, a calm lake reflecting the divine, was now a furious, churning storm. It raced not with spiritual contemplation, but with the stark earthly clamor of diocesan protocols, of legal obligations, of the ethical dilemmas I might soon face. My sacred duty as a pastor, to offer solace in spiritual guidance, warred violently, painfully with my civic conscience, which screamed for immediate, pragmatic intervention. I was meant to be an instrument of God's boundless love, a shepherd to my flock, a source of gentle comfort. But in that agonizing moment, all I could feel was a profound sense of outrage, a visceral protest against what I perceived, with stark certainty, as an unimaginable dereliction of parental care. This wasn't an act of faith, I adamantly told myself, pushing down a nascent whisper of doubt. It was an act of surrender so desperate, so complete, that it bordered on the reckless, risking a public tragedy of the most horrifying kind. An indelible scar upon the sanctity of this holy place and the hearts of my congregation. Every fiber of my being, every nerve ending, screamed for me to stop, to break the liturgical flow. I yearned to descend from the altar, to stride down the aisle, to intervene, to gently but firmly demand they take her immediately to a hospital where sterile machines and trained professionals, with their quiet competence, could at least offer a chance, however slim, however cold, to prolong that fragile flicker of life, to provide a measure of peace in its passing, that this public spectacle surely could not. The contrast between the stark white walls of a hospital ward and the sun-drenched, stained glass beauty of the church seemed immense. Yet I felt a perverse longing for the clinical efficiency of the former. But the congregation was settling, their quiet rustling subsiding. Their gazes, utterly unaware of the full horror and ethical quandary I perceived, turned expectantly towards me, ready for the Mass to begin. The young altar servers, barely beyond childhood themselves, stood ready at my side, their faces alight with the simple, unburdened joy of serving, their small, pure hearts innocent of the encroaching shadows. How could I shatter the fragile peace of this holy space? This sacred ritual that had sustained souls for centuries, with the raw, desperate reality of a child's last breaths. How could I, Father Michael, a man sworn to compassion, consecrated to gentle guidance, abruptly descend from the altar and publicly condemn her parents, however misguided I believed them to be? The thought was unthinkable, a profanity within itself. The conflict raged within me, a silent internal battle that shook the very foundations of my priestly composure, threatening to crack the carefully constructed facade of serene devotion. The air in the church, already heavy with the scent of old wood and beeswax, seemed to grow impossibly thick, laden with unspoken questions, with the collective weight of unseen prayers from hearts hoping for some divine intervention for this family. But for me it was filled with the crushing certainty of impending disaster. I found myself, despite my best efforts to focus on the sacred, envisioning the scene with vivid, horrifying clarity. The child collapsing in the pew, her final rattling breath echoing in the sudden silence, the inevitable screams, the frantic paramedics rushing in, their urgent voices and clinical equipment a terrible final desecration of the sanctuary. A cold dread, far deeper and more primal than any theological struggle, settled in my heart like a stone, cementing my conviction that a tragedy was not merely possible, but inevitable, about to unfold before my entire congregation, leaving an indelible wound. It was a premonition so strong, so utterly convincing in its grim details, that it utterly blinded me to any other possibility, any other outcome. I was so sure, so absolutely terrifyingly sure of what was to come. I know now, looking back through the gentle veil of time, with the profound, humbling benefit of an experience that did not merely challenge, but utterly unraveled the very fabric of my human understanding, that every single assumption I made in those agonizing minutes was spectacularly, unbelievably, gloriously incorrect. Every judgment I cast, every fear that gripped my soul, every cynical thought that dared to tarnish the sacred space of my mind that morning was a lie. I was a priest, a man of God, entrusted to see beyond the veil, and yet I was utterly blind, trapped in the narrow confines of my own earthly logic and fear. I stood, unknowingly, on the precipice of witnessing something so transcendent, so utterly beyond mortal comprehension, that it would forever redefine my understanding of faith, of miracles, and of the raw, untamed, magnificent power of the divine. But at that moment, as I struggled, a heavy stone of doubt and fear in my gut, to raise my hands and begin the ancient hallowed words of the Mass, all I felt was the crushing, suffocating weight of human failing, my own, and, as I saw it, theirs. I was absolutely certain that I was about to preside over a wake, a somber procession of grief rather than a Mass, a joyful celebration of life. I was so terribly wrong. God help me, I was so utterly, profoundly, breathtakingly wrong. It is a humbling truth to carry, a testament to the fact that even in our certainty, especially in our certainty, we are merely vessels, often incapable of grasping the infinite tapestry of God's design. As the opening prayers faded into the sacred quiet of the nave, a subtle shift began within me. The initial surge of alarm, that urgent, almost clinical concern for diocesan protocols, and the stark reality of the child's visible suffering began to recede, yielding to something far deeper, far more personal. The vestments, usually a comforting weight, now felt like a shroud, and the chill of apprehension that had settled in my heart began to thaw, replaced by an aching, profound sadness. My gaze, drawn inexorably to the tiny figure in the front pew, lingered. The bright, sterile glow of the medical pack seemed a stark intrusion into the warm, aged wood and stained glass hues of our sanctuary, a cruel reminder of a world of sickness that too often seemed to overshadow the very hope we gathered to celebrate. I knew them, of course, not merely as faces in the congregation, but intimately, as one comes to know the very heart of their flock. They were the Millers, Mark, Sarah, and their 7-year-old daughter Lily. The name itself, Lily, had always conjured images of purity, of delicate beauty, of a blossoming innocence. Now, hearing it, seeing her, only brought a fresh sting of sorrow. I remember the day Lily was born, the proud parents beaming, sharing photos, a new light in our parish family. She had been a vibrant, laughing child, a frequent sight skipping down the aisle after Mass, her voice a cheerful echo in the often solemn church halls. Before this, before the shadowed landscape of sickness had claimed them, the Millers had been pillars of our small community, their faith a luminous example. Mark, with his steady hands and even temperament, had been the head of our parish council for 5 dedicated years, navigating budgets and building projects with a quiet diligence that earned everyone's respect. He was the kind of man who didn't just attend Mass. He lived its principles, his commitment to service an extension of his deep-rooted belief. And Sarah, dear Sarah, she had run the food pantry with a tireless grace that defied explanation. Her days were a blur of organizing donations, comforting the distraught, and always finding a way to make sure no one left hungry. Her laughter was infectious, her spirit indomitable, a constant source of warmth and practical charity. Their marriage, too, was a testament, built on mutual respect and a shared devotion to God and to each other. They were, in every sense, good people, the kind who anchored a community, quietly embodying the virtues we all strived for. But that was before the diagnosis. The words themselves, when I first heard them, rare and aggressive form of leukemia, had hung in the air like a death knell, echoing with a chilling finality. I remember the phone call from Mark, his voice usually so steady, thin and reedy, a mere whisper of its former self. He hadn't needed to say much. The dread was palpable, a cold, creeping fog that had begun to steal the light from their lives. Over the past year, the illness had done more than just ravage Lily's body. It had systematically consumed every facet of their existence. Their savings, once carefully accrued for Lily's future, for college, for the simple dreams of a family, had dwindled to nothing, then to debt. I saw the statements, the crushing weight of medical bills, the endless therapies, the experimental treatments that offered fleeting glimpses of hope only to snatch them away. Each new specialist, each distant clinic, each desperate measure exacted not just a financial toll, but a spiritual one. The practical demands of constant care, the exhaustion of sleepless nights by a hospital bed, the endless cycle of hope and crushing disappointment, these were the invisible taxes of their suffering, levied on their very souls. And I feared profoundly for their faith. I had watched it, once a sturdy, vibrant tree, slowly begin to wither under the relentless onslaught of sorrow. I had visited them in sterile hospital rooms, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken prayers. I had sat in their once vibrant home, now quiet and shadowed, the laughter replaced by a suffocating silence, broken only by the beeping of medical equipment, or Lily's shallow cough. I had seen the bright spark of hope in Sarah's eyes dim, then flicker, then become merely a grim, exhausted resilience. It was the kind of resilience that comes not from an abundance of faith, but from the sheer, brutal necessity of continuing to breathe, to fight, when every cell in your body longs to surrender. Mark, once so stoic, would sometimes just stare out the window, his shoulders hunched, a man drowning not in tears, but in a silent ocean of despair. His prayers, I suspected, had become less expressions of trust, and more desperate guttural cries for intervention, for a reason, for anything. They were good people, trapped in an impossible situation. The phrase echoed in my mind with a hollow resonance. How could a loving God allow such suffering to befall a family so devoted, so full of grace? This was the question that gnawed at my own spirit, a persistent, unsettling query that no theological treatise could adequately answer. I had offered counsel, quoted scripture, prayed alongside them until my own voice was hoarse and my knees ached. I had assured them of God's love, even in the midst of the storm, but my words often felt thin, inadequate, a mere whisper against the howling gale of their reality. Their faith, I could sense, was not gone, but it had been stripped bare, exposed to the harsh elements, clinging by the thinnest of threads. It was no longer the confident, buoyant faith of earlier years, but a raw, bruised thing, barely able to sustain itself. And now they were here, in the front pew of my church, placing a public spectacle of their last resort. It wasn't merely a private sorrow anymore, it was laid bare for all to see. A stark, uncomfortable testament to human vulnerability and divine mystery. I understood their presence not as an act of serene trust, but as one of desperate, almost reckless, gamble. They were here, I felt, because there was nowhere else to go, no other stone left unturned, no other medical avenue left unexplored. This Mass, this sacred space, had become their final court of appeal, their last fervent plea to a God who, to their weary eyes, must have seemed distant, perhaps even silent. The burden they placed on God, and implicitly on this sacred moment, felt immense, almost too heavy to bear. Not for God, perhaps, for surely His capacity is infinite, but for us, for the human heart struggling to reconcile such profound suffering with the promise of divine love. I saw their bowed heads, the way their shoulders barely moved as they breathed, the almost imperceptible tremor in Sarah's hand as it rested on Lily's tiny arm. It wasn't the peace of true resignation, but the taut tension of a last, desperate hope. It was a hope that had been so battered, so eroded by countless disappointments, that it had become sharp-edged, fragile, and utterly consuming. My own heart ached with their unspoken plea, a silent chorus of, "Lord, if you can, please help us." I felt in that moment the immense, terrifying responsibility of my office, not just to offer the liturgy, but to somehow, through this sacred ritual, bridge the chasm between their profound need and what felt like God's heartbreaking silence. I feared for them, for their continued pain, and I feared for the shattering of what little faith they had left, should this final, fervent appeal go unanswered. The Mass had barely begun, and already I felt the suffocating weight of their fragile, almost broken hope. As the opening prayers faded into the sacred quiet of the nave, a subtle shift began within me. The initial surge of alarm, that urgent, almost clinical concern for diocesan protocols, and the stark reality of the child's visible suffering began to recede, yielding to something far deeper, far more personal. The vestments, usually a comforting weight, now felt like a shroud, and the chill of apprehension that had settled in my heart began to thaw, replaced by an aching, profound sadness. My gaze, drawn inexorably to the tiny figure in the front pew, lingered. The bright, sterile glow of the medical pack seemed a stark intrusion into the warm, aged wood and stained glass hues of our sanctuary, a cruel reminder of a world of sickness that too often seemed to overshadow the very hope we gathered to celebrate. I knew them, of course, not merely as faces in the congregation, but intimately, as one comes to know the very heart of their flock. They were the Millers, Mark, Sarah, and their 7-year-old daughter Lily. The name itself, Lily, had always conjured images of purity, of delicate beauty, of a blossoming innocence. Now, hearing it, seeing her, only brought a fresh sting of sorrow. I remember the day Lily was born, the proud parents beaming, sharing photos, a new light in our parish family. She had been a vibrant, laughing child, a frequent sight skipping down the aisle after Mass, her voice a cheerful echo in the often solemn church halls. Before this, before the shadowed landscape of sickness had claimed them, the Millers had been pillars of our small community, their faith a luminous example. Mark, with his steady hands and even temperament, had been the head of our parish council for 5 dedicated years, navigating budgets and building projects with a quiet diligence that earned everyone's respect. He was the kind of man who didn't just attend Mass, he lived its principles, his commitment to service an extension of his deep-rooted belief. And Sarah, dear Sarah, she had run the food pantry with a tireless grace that defied explanation. Her days were a blur of organizing donations, comforting the distraught, and always finding a way to make sure no one left hungry. Her laughter was infectious, her spirit indomitable, a constant source of warmth and practical charity. Their marriage, too, was a testament, built on mutual respect and a shared devotion to God and to each other. They were, in every sense, good people, the kind who anchored a community, quietly embodying the virtues we all strived for. But that was before the diagnosis. The words themselves, when I first heard them, rare and aggressive form of leukemia, had hung in the air like a death knell, echoing with a chilling finality. I remember the phone call from Mark, his voice usually so steady, thin and reedy, a mere whisper of its former self. He hadn't needed to say much. The dread was palpable, a cold, creeping fog that had begun to steal the light from their lives. Over the past year, the illness had done more than just ravage Lily's body. It had systematically consumed every facet of their existence. Their savings, once carefully accrued for Lily's future, for college, for the simple dreams of a family, had dwindled to nothing, then to debt. I saw the statements, the crushing weight of medical bills, the endless therapies, the experimental treatments that offered fleeting glimpses of hope only to snatch them away. Each new specialist, each distant clinic, each desperate measure exacted not just a financial toll but a spiritual one. The practical demands of constant care, the exhaustion of sleepless nights by a hospital bed, the endless cycle of hope and crushing disappointment, these were the invisible taxes of their suffering, levied on their very souls, and I feared profoundly for their faith. I had watched it, once a sturdy, vibrant tree, slowly begin to wither under the relentless onslaught of sorrow. I had visited them in sterile hospital rooms, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken prayers. I had sat in their once vibrant home, now quiet and shadowed, the laughter replaced by a suffocating silence, broken only by the beeping of medical equipment, or Lily's shallow cough. I had seen the bright spark of hope in Sarah's eyes dim, then flicker, then become merely a grim, exhausted resilience. It was the kind of resilience that comes not from an abundance of faith, but from the sheer brutal necessity of continuing to breathe, to fight, when every cell in your body longs to surrender. Mark, once so stoic, would sometimes just stare out the window, his shoulders hunched, a man drowning not in tears, but in a silent ocean of despair. His prayers, I suspected, had become less expressions of trust and more desperate guttural cries for intervention, for a reason, for anything. They were good people, trapped in an impossible situation. The phrase echoed in my mind with a hollow resonance. How could a loving God allow such suffering to befall a family so devoted, so full of grace? This was the question that gnawed at my own spirit, a persistent, unsettling query that no theological treatise could adequately answer. I had offered counsel, quoted scripture, prayed alongside them until my own voice was hoarse and my knees ached. I had assured them of God's love, even in the midst of the storm, but my words often felt thin, inadequate, a mere whisper against the howling gale of their reality. Their faith, I could sense, was not gone, but it had been stripped bare, exposed to the harsh elements, clinging by the thinnest of threads. It was no longer the confident, buoyant faith of earlier years, but a raw, bruised thing, barely able to sustain itself. And now they were here, in the front pew of my church, placing a public spectacle of their last resort. It wasn't merely a private sorrow anymore, it was laid bare for all to see, a stark, uncomfortable testament to human vulnerability and divine mystery. I understood their presence not as an act of serene trust, but as one of desperate, almost reckless, gamble. They were here, I felt, because there was nowhere else to go. No other stone left unturned, no other medical avenue left unexplored. This Mass, this sacred space, had become their final court of appeal, their last fervent plea to a God who, to their weary eyes, must have seemed distant, perhaps even silent. The burden they placed on God, and implicitly on this sacred moment, felt immense, almost too heavy to bear. Not for God, perhaps, for surely His capacity is infinite, but for us, for the human heart struggling to reconcile such profound suffering with the promise of divine love. I saw their bowed heads, the way their shoulders barely moved as they breathed, the almost imperceptible tremor in Sarah's hand as it rested on Lily's tiny arm. It wasn't the peace of true resignation, but the taut tension of a last desperate hope. It was a hope that had been so battered, so eroded by countless disappointments, that it had become sharp-edged, fragile, and utterly consuming. My own heart ached with their unspoken plea, a silent chorus of, "Lord, if you can, please help us." I felt in that moment the immense, terrifying responsibility of my office, not just to offer the liturgy, but to somehow, through this sacred ritual, bridge the chasm between their profound need and what felt like God's heartbreaking silence. I feared for them, for their continued pain, and I feared for the shattering of what little faith they had left, should this final, fervent appeal go unanswered. The Mass had barely begun, and already I felt the suffocating weight of their fragile, almost broken hope. I feared for them, for their continued pain, and I feared for the shattering of what little faith they had left, should this final, fervent appeal go unanswered. The Mass had barely begun, and already I felt the suffocating weight of their fragile, almost broken hope. As I moved from the altar, carrying the lectionary towards the ambo, a subtle shift in the air of St. Michael's became palpable. It was not a physical change but an atmospheric one, like the hush that falls just before a summer storm, heavy with unspoken anticipation. My initial frantic concern for Lily's physical state and my internal debate over protocol had begun to recede, replaced by a more profound spiritual apprehension. Now, as I prepared to proclaim the sacred word, I felt the collective gaze of the entire parish, 1,000 invisible threads of worry, sympathy, and desperate yearning, all converging on the small silent tableau in the front pew. Mark, Sarah, and their barely visible daughter. There were no whispers, no rustling of programs, none of the usual small distractions that accompany the beginning of Sunday Mass. Instead, there was a heavy shared silence, deeper than mere reverence. It was the silence of a community holding its breath, together. This was not a community of strangers, after all. St. Michael's Parish, nestled in the heart of our small, unassuming town, was more an extended family than a mere congregation. We knew each other's joys and sorrows, celebrated baptisms and mourned losses with a closeness that often blurred the lines between neighbor and kin. And everyone, absolutely everyone, knew of Lily Miller's battle. My eyes, trained by years of pastoral observation, swept across the familiar faces, each etched with a silent narrative. In the third pew, old Mrs. Gable, her back perpetually stooped like a question mark, clutched her rosary tighter. Her knuckles, gnarled with age and arthritic pain, were white against the smooth, worn beads. I could almost hear the whispered incantations, the fervent repetitions of Hail Mary, full of grace. I knew Mrs. Gable had prayed for Lily every single day since the diagnosis, offering up her own aches and infirmities as a small, humble sacrifice. Her faith was a stubborn, ancient oak, rooted deep in generations of tradition, unyielding in the face of life's gales. Yet even in her eyes, I saw a flicker of the same strained hope that afflicted the Millers. Her lips moved, forming prayers, but her gaze was fixed, not on the altar, but on the small, fragile head of Lily. Further back, in their usual section near the stained glass window depicting St. Michael himself, the Knights of Columbus sat in a silent phalanx. Big, burly men, many of them farmers whose hands were accustomed to turning stubborn earth. Their faces were now drawn with a grim determination. Their solidarity was a testament to the community's investment in Lily's well-being. They had organized pancake breakfasts, car washes, and silent auctions. They had volunteered their time to help Mark with repairs around his house, ensuring he could spend more precious hours at Lily's bedside. They had carried the financial burdens, the practical burdens, and now they carried the spiritual burden. Their stares were fixed forward, not quite on me, nor on the Millers, but seemingly into some distant, unseen horizon, as if by sheer force of will they could bend the heavens to their purpose. These were men who believed in action, in tangible results, and the helplessness of Lily's illness must have gnawed at them, questioning the very efficacy of their devotion. Lily's illness, a rare and aggressive form of leukemia, was more than just a medical tragedy confined to one family. It was a wound on the entire parish. It was a pervasive, constant ache, a nagging question that lingered in the air after every Mass, every Bible study, every potluck dinner. It was the question of suffering, of course. Why? Why this child? Why the good, the innocent? It was the question of the silence of God. Where was he in the sterile hospital rooms, in the countless sleepless nights, in the fading hope of a mother and father? We had all prayed, individually and collectively. We had offered the rosary, novenas, petitions during the liturgy of the Word, and countless small silent pleas throughout our days. We had brought casseroles, offered rides, helped with groceries, and simply sat with Mark and Sarah in their exhaustion, offering whatever meager comfort we could. And yet, Lily's condition had only worsened, a slow, agonizing decline that defied all our prayers, all our efforts, all our faith. This shared sorrow, this communal wound, made the very act of celebrating Mass feel different, heavier. The familiar ritual, designed to lift our hearts to God, felt burdened by the very human struggle unfolding before us. The words of the Scriptures, usually a source of comfort and guidance, seemed to echo with a different resonance today, filtered through the prism of Lily's pain. As I read the first reading, a passage from Isaiah about God's unwavering presence, my voice, usually steady, wavered. Could I truly speak of God's comfort when such profound discomfort sat just feet from me? Could I speak of hope to a family whose hope was clearly, visibly worn thin? My homily, planned weeks ago, was to be on the theme of joyful perseverance. I had meticulously crafted it, weaving together tales of saints who found joy in their trials, reminding my flock that even in the darkest valleys, God's light could still be found. I had intended to speak of the strength of spirit, the grace of acceptance, the quiet triumph of enduring faith, but now the words felt like ash in my mouth. They felt hollow, tone-deaf, almost cruel in their blithe optimism. How could I possibly speak of joy with such palpable, heartbreaking sorrow sitting right before me? Lily's fading light mocked every carefully chosen phrase, every uplifting anecdote. The weight of the lectionary in my hands felt immense, not just the physical weight of leather and paper, but the spiritual weight of centuries of sacred text. now confronting the raw, present reality of suffering. My gaze drifted once more to the Millers. Sarah had her head bowed, her hair, once lustrous and vibrant, now dull and flecked with gray, falling over Lily's still form. Mark's shoulders were hunched, a posture of defeat I had come to know all too well. They weren't looking for joyful perseverance. They were looking for a miracle. They were looking for an answer, any answer, to the unbearable question of why. And I, their shepherd, their spiritual guide, felt utterly profoundly unprepared to offer one. My theological training, my years of reflection, my spiritual exercises, they all seemed to crumble in the face of this tangible, suffering child. What good were abstract concepts of divine plan and transcendent joy when a little girl was slowly slipping away, her life measured by the faint beep of a machine? My own faith, usually a wellspring of comfort and certainty, felt stretched thin, taut, and fragile. I found myself silently pleading, not just for the Millers, but for myself, for the entire parish. We needed not just words, but a sign. We needed not just comfort, but a palpable intervention. The silence in the church was not empty. It was full, saturated with unspoken prayers, with shared grief, with the collective burden of a community that had exhausted every human means to help. It was a silence that spoke of profound empathy, but also of profound helplessness. And in that silence, I understood the true, terrifying magnitude of the expectation that rested upon this Mass, upon this moment. It was no longer just a weekly ritual. It had become a crucible of faith, a desperate appeal to a God who, to our earthly eyes, had remained so achingly, terribly silent. As I stood at the ambo, my eyes once again on the Millers, I knew my planned homily was impossible. I would have to find different words, words born not of prepared text, but of the raw, aching reality of the moment, words that somehow acknowledged the depth of their suffering, and perhaps, just perhaps, dared to whisper of a hope that even I struggled to fully grasp. The weight of the parish pressed down on me, a physical ache in my chest as I approached the ambo. My hands, I noticed, trembled ever so slightly as I placed them on the cool, polished wood. The silence that followed the liturgy of the word was not the familiar, comfortable silence of a congregation absorbing scripture, but the heavy, expectant quiet of people waiting for a verdict. It was the silence I had just reflected upon, one of profound empathy and even more profound helplessness, where the terrifying magnitude of expectation rested not just on this Mass, but on my words, on this moment. I had to find words that acknowledged the depth of their suffering, and dared to whisper of a hope that even I, in that moment, struggled to fully grasp. My planned homily, with its cheerful exhortations to joyful perseverance, felt not merely inappropriate, but cruel. I looked at the stack of notes, crisp and neatly typed, lying before me on the ambo. My eyes skimmed the bolded headings, the virtue of cheerfulness, finding God in every moment, the call to active optimism. Each phrase, usually a source of comfort and guidance, now felt like a shard of glass, utterly out of place in this cathedral of quiet anguish. To utter them would be to betray the very hearts that beat before me, the very souls that bled in the front pew. I could not, in good conscience, preach such a sermon. With a deliberateness that belied the sudden stark panic within me, I reached out and gently but firmly pushed the notes aside. They slid to the far edge of the ambo, a small symbolic gesture of surrender to the Spirit. I felt a collective, almost imperceptible shift in the pews, a quiet stirring of awareness that something unplanned was about to unfold. My gaze swept across the congregation, taking in the worried brows, the tightly clasped hands, the glistening eyes, and then, as always, my eyes found their way back to the Miller family. They were a tableau of silent suffering. Mark's shoulders, usually broad and confident, were hunched, his head bowed so low his chin almost touched his chest. Sarah sat rigid beside him, her gaze fixed downwards, her hands clasped not in front of her, but over Lily's small, still form. Their fingers were intertwined, a desperate knot of shared burden, a silent covenant of love and sorrow. Lily, nestled between them, seemed smaller than ever, a fragile porcelain doll against the dark wood of the pew, her faint, rhythmic medical beep a quiet, insistent counterpoint to the church's profound silence. I drew a deep breath, the air thick with unspoken prayers, with unvoiced questions, with the raw, palpable presence of grief. My voice, when it finally emerged, was not the resonant, sermon-ready tone I usually commanded. It was softer, more hesitant, imbued with the tremor of genuine empathy, the ache of shared humanity. "My dear brothers and sisters in Christ," I began, my gaze lingering on Lily for a moment longer. "The readings today call us to perseverance, to joy in the Lord. And ordinarily I would speak to you of that joy, of the light that always follows the darkness. But today," I paused, searching for the honest truth. It was not a rhetorical pause, It was a genuine moment of seeking, of laying bare my own struggle before them. Today, my heart tells me to speak not of the joy that seems so distant to many of us right now, but of the faith we find when all joy has seemingly fled. To speak of trusting in a plan we cannot possibly comprehend, a plan that from our earthly vantage point often feels bewildering, even cruel. A low murmur, almost like a sigh, rippled through the pews. It was not disagreement, but recognition, an acknowledgement that I saw them, that I felt their pain, that I was not going to offer them platitudes. We are told to have faith, I continued, my voice gaining a fragile strength, and we pray for miracles. But what happens when the miracle doesn't come? What happens when the darkness deepens, and the light seems to recede further and further, until we are left grasping in the shadows, wondering where God has gone? I paused again, letting the question hang in the heavy air. I knew intimately the thoughts that coursed through the hearts of those before me. They had prayed for Lily. They had begged. They had sacrificed. And yet, the darkness persisted. It is in those moments, my friends, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, that faith becomes less about certainty and more about radical trust. It becomes less about knowing the answers and more about holding fast to the hand of a God we cannot see, cannot understand, but who we choose in the deepest part of our being to believe is still there, even when the silence is deafening, even when the suffering is unbearable. I spoke of the Old Testament prophets who pleaded with God through famine and exile, their voices hoarse with despair, yet never fully abandoning hope. I spoke of Job, stripped of everything, sitting in ashes, who still managed to declare, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." I spoke too of Christ in Gethsemane, crying out, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Even our Lord, in his humanity, wrestled with the bitter cup, with the incomprehensible will of the Father. Faith in its rawest, most profound form, I explained, my eyes scanning the faces, seeing the tears now flowing freely down some cheeks, is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to persist in belief even when doubt is all around us. It is the ability to whisper, "Thy will be done," even when our hearts are screaming for, "My will be done." It is accepting that God's plan is not always our plan, that His wisdom transcends our finite understanding, and that His love, though sometimes expressed in ways we cannot immediately fathom, is always, always present. My gaze returned to Mark and Sarah. They had not moved. Their heads remained bowed, their hands still clasped, a living sculpture of profound, aching supplication. Their shoulders, however, were now subtly shaking, a silent tremor, a deep internal convulsion of prayer and pain. I saw it not as the quiet surrender of the soul, but as something more urgent, more primal. It was the posture of desperate bargaining. I understood it, not just intellectually but spiritually. I had seen it before, in hospital rooms, at bedsides, in the desperate pleas whispered at gravesides. It was the final all-or-nothing gamble of a heart that has exhausted every other avenue. They weren't peacefully supplicating, asking for God's will, whatever it may be. No, they were imploring. They were pouring out the last vestiges of their hope, their trust, their very being, onto the altar of God, demanding, in the quietest way possible, that He act. This was their final appeal to heaven. They had done everything humanly possible. Doctors, treatments, prayers, fundraisers, endless nights by Lily's bedside, the slow, agonizing erosion of their life savings, their peace of mind, their very spirit. And now, having reached the absolute precipice, they stood here in this sacred space, laying their most precious possession, their daughter's life, at the foot of the altar, not as an offering to be accepted or rejected, but as an ultimatum, a plea born of utter, unadulterated desperation. "Here she is, Lord. We have nothing left. We give her to you. Now, you must act." It was a dangerous prayer in a way, a prayer that risked everything. If God remained silent, if the suffering continued, if the worst were to happen, what then? What would become of their faith, already worn so thin by a year of relentless torment? What would become of our faith? The collective faith of this parish, which had watched their struggle with bated breath and aching hearts. The air in the church, already heavy with the collective burden, grew thick with a tension that was purely spiritual, almost tangible. It was like standing on the edge of a great chasm, feeling the immense forces of nature at play, a pressure building, unseen but profoundly felt. It was the sense of a great, unseen scale waiting to be tipped. On one side of this scale, I imagined, lay Lily's life, her fragility, the miller's raw, agonizing love, the countless prayers of this community, the desperate, trembling faith of a mother and father who had nowhere else to turn. On the other side, the immense, unfathomable will of God, His divine plan, which we, in our limited understanding, often perceived as silence, as absence, the mystery of suffering, the sovereignty of a Creator whose ways are not our ways. And in the balance, swaying precariously, was hope. Not a light, fleeting hope, but the profound, weighty hope that asks for everything, that dares to believe against all evidence, that cries out from the depths, refusing to be silenced. I thought of Abraham, willing to sacrifice Isaac, trusting that God would provide. I thought of the Syrophoenician woman, begging Jesus for her daughter, not deterred by his initial refusal, clinging to the smallest crumb of hope. Mark and Sarah were in that sacred, terrifying space now. The space where faith becomes a battle, a desperate grapple with the divine, not out of disrespect, but out of the deepest, most primal need. I felt it myself, this spiritual tension, pulling at my own soul. As a priest, I am called to be an intermediary, a conduit of grace. But in this moment, I felt as helpless as any parishioner. My carefully studied theology, my years of pastoral experience, my well-practiced words of comfort, they all seemed utterly inadequate in the face of such profound human anguish and such an overwhelming divine mystery. I was not just a priest delivering a homily, I was a fellow pilgrim standing alongside them at the edge of that chasm, holding my breath, my own heart whispering its own desperate prayer for mercy, for a sign, for something. My sermon concluded not with a flourish, but with a humble, almost broken plea. So let us, in this holy Mass, lay bare our hearts before God. Let us acknowledge our pain, our confusion, our desperate need. And let us, with whatever reserves of faith we can muster, surrender to His will, trusting that even in the darkest night, He is the light, and His love, though sometimes hidden from our sight, never abandons us. Let us pray for strength, for understanding, and for His mercy. Amen. The Amen was swallowed by the silence, a silence different now from the one before. It was not just expectant, but reverent, saturated with the collective weight of hearts laid bare. I stepped down from the ambo, my knees feeling strangely weak. The homily, brief and faltering as it was, had drained me. I had spoken from the core of my being, from a place of shared vulnerability. I had acknowledged the abyss without presuming to bridge it myself, simply pointing perhaps to the unseen hand that might still reach across. Now came the liturgy of the Eucharist, the preparing of the gifts, the consecration. The very heart of our faith, where the veil between heaven and earth is at its thinnest. The desperate bargaining of Mark and Sarah, and of the entire parish, would now meet the ultimate act of divine grace, the mystery of the real presence. A new kind of anticipation settled over the church, a mixture of solemnity and an almost unbearable spiritual tension. The scale, I felt, was still poised, waiting, and the moment of tipping was drawing near. The ambo had felt like an exposed promontory, a lonely place from which to confess my own smallness, my own faltering hope in the face of such profound human suffering. Standing there, the elevated platform seemed to amplify my vulnerability, the chill of the morning air, though imperceptible to most, biting at my exposed hands as I gestured. I could feel the collective weight of the congregation's gaze, not in judgment, but in shared sorrow and desperate longing. My own frailty, my limits as a man of God, felt starkly, painfully clear. What comfort could I offer in the face of such an abyss? My heart ached with the memory of countless other losses, other unanswered prayers, whispers of doubt that sometimes crept into my own soul in the quiet hours before dawn, threatening to erode the very foundations of my priestly vows. My knees indeed still carried that peculiar weakness, a physical manifestation of the spiritual fatigue that had settled deep in my bones over the past year, watching Lily waste away, witnessing the miller's slow, agonizing despair. It wasn't just physical strain from standing, it was a deeper enervation, a weariness born of empathy and the relentless battle against the very real suffering that mocked all easy answers. The homily, brief and faltering as it was, had drained me, leaving an echo of hollowness in my chest. I had spoken from the core of my being, from a place of shared vulnerability, not as an authority with solutions, but as a fellow traveler in the valley of shadows. I had acknowledged the abyss without presuming to bridge it myself, simply pointing perhaps to the unseen hand that might still reach across, a plea for faith even when sight was dimmed, a desperate whisper of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, God was present even in the deepest silence. Now came the liturgy of the Eucharist, the preparing of the gifts, the consecration. This was it. The very heart of our faith, where the veil between heaven and earth is at its thinnest, gossamer fine and shimmering with unseen light. This was the moment where the desperate bargaining of Mark and Sarah, and of the entire parish, would now meet the ultimate act of divine grace, the mystery of the real presence. A new kind of anticipation settled over the church, a palpable weight that made the air feel heavier, a mixture of solemnity so profound it bordered on dread, and an almost unbearable spiritual tension that vibrated through the very pews. It was a tension born of ancient ritual meeting raw, immediate human need. The scale, I felt, was still poised, trembling, waiting for the slightest breath to sway it. And the moment of tipping was drawing near. The offertory, with its familiar rhythm, passed in a blur of motion and muted sound, a distant, gentle current against the roaring torrent of my inner turmoil. I remember the rustle of hymnals, like dry leaves skittering across a forest floor, the soft, rhythmic creak of the collection baskets being passed along the pews, a sound that usually brought me a quiet comfort, a testament to community. I registered the faint, comforting scent of old wood and beeswax in the sanctuary, a smell that always anchored me to centuries of prayer and presence within these hallowed walls. But these sensory details registered on the periphery, like distant echoes or colors seen through a frosted pane. My mind, a turbulent sea of prayer and apprehension, was already far ahead, fixed with an unwavering intensity on the altar, on the sacred vessels, on the momentous act that was soon to unfold. Each breaking wave of thought was a petition, each ebb a fear, all crashing against the shores of the impending consecration. The weight of this holy task, heightened by the specific urgent need of Lily Miller, pressed down on me, not as a burden, but as a sacred trust, a terrifying privilege. My hands, usually so steady, so accustomed to the precise movements of the liturgy, felt almost alien as I accepted the simple gifts of bread and wine from the altar servers. Their young faces, scrubbed clean and earnest, radiated an innocent piety, entirely oblivious to the cosmic drama that seemed to hover just above our heads, a silent, unseen storm about to break. I moved with a practiced, almost instinctual grace, my body remembering the ancient steps even as my mind reeled with a kaleidoscope of prayers and fears. Each movement, though rote from decades of performance, now carried an extraordinary significance. The white linen corporal, pristine and sharp-edged, laid out upon the altar, seemed to gleam with an inner light in the filtered morning light, a sacred cloth awaiting the body of Christ. The paten, a disk of polished gold, cool and smooth beneath my fingertips, held the large, unleavened host, soon to be transfigured. Its perfect circularity seemed to symbolize the unbroken covenant, the endless mercy. Then the chalice, heavy and cool in my grasp, into which I poured the wine, red as blood, adding a single ritual drop of water. This ancient gesture, I knew, symbolized Christ's humanity mingled with his divinity, our own fragile lives immersed in his boundless grace. Usually it was a moment of profound theological contemplation, a quiet reminder of our salvation, a meditative pause in the flow of the Mass. Today it felt like an intensely practical act, a preparation for an encounter that felt less symbolic and more acutely, devastatingly real. This was not merely a ritual, it was an urgent plea, a direct invocation, a last desperate act of faith for a family on the precipice of loss. My internal prayer, usually a tapestry of petitions for the world, for the church, for the needs of my flock, a sprawling landscape of intercession for peace, for healing, for justice, narrowed to a laser-like focus, piercing through the spiritual fog. "Lord, have mercy," I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself, lost amidst the muted hum of the sacristy fan and the distant muffled cough from the pews. It was a whisper that tore through my very soul. On them, and on all of us. On them, I thought, my gaze instinctively drawn to the front pew, to the small, unmoving form of Lily, a living, breathing question mark placed before the altar, challenging the very notion of divine benevolence. Her stillness was a profound testament to her suffering, her tiny body a canvas upon which the agony of her illness was etched. On Mark, whose shoulders seemed to bear the weight of a dying star, stooped and strained, his face a roadmap of grief and a stubborn, desperate hope, etched with sleepless nights and silent tears. His jaw was set, a testament to a strength I knew he was close to losing. On Sarah, whose hands, clasped so tightly over Lily's small hand, seemed to plead with every fiber of her being, a silent, all-consuming cry to the heavens, her knuckles white, her whole being vibrating with a silent scream. Mercy for their incomprehensible suffering, for the cruel injustice that had befallen their innocent child, for the exhaustion that must have long ago replaced sleep, for the fear that had become their constant companion, a cold, unwelcome guest in their home and hearts. Mercy for the erosion of their joy, for the tests that had stretched their faith to its very limit, threatening to snap it like a dried twig in a harsh winter wind, leaving them utterly broken and desolate. And, on all of us, I expanded my silent plea, encompassing not just the Millers, but the entire congregation, this small community gathered in a shared crucible of faith and doubt, bound together by the invisible threads of empathy and shared experience. Mercy for Mrs. Gable, whose rosary beads were now intertwined so tightly her knuckles were white, her heart surely aching for Lily, perhaps remembering her own long-lost children, the pang of ancient grief mingling with this fresh, raw wound. Mercy for the Knights of Columbus, their stern faces belying the tenderness in their hearts, their collective prayers a silent, determined roar against the injustice of this illness, their brows furrowed in a silent communion of sorrow. Mercy for the young families in the back, their children innocently oblivious, for the elderly contemplating their own mortality, for the teenagers wrestling with questions of meaning and fairness. Mercy for every soul who had known Lily, who had prayed, who had hoped, and who now, perhaps, felt the chill breath of despair, a cold whisper in the sanctuary, threatening to extinguish their own flickering flames of hope. Mercy for their questions, for their unspoken challenges to God, for their weariness in the face of suffering that seemed to mock their earnest supplications, rendering their fervent prayers seemingly unheard. And yes, on all of us meant mercy for myself too. Mercy for my own failing faith, for the flicker of doubt that sometimes threatened to extinguish the priestly zeal I had nurtured for decades, a subtle venom leaching into my spirit. Mercy for the burden of expectation that pressed down on my shoulders, the unspoken plea from the congregation for answers I did not possess, for comfort I sometimes felt too empty to give, my wellspring of solace seemingly dry. Here at the altar, I was not merely a servant performing a sacred duty. I was one of them, a struggling pilgrim, burdened by the same anxieties, wrestling with the same mysteries, the same silent screams for divine intervention. I was a priest, yes, consecrated and set apart by the laying on of hands, but I was also a man, flesh and blood, utterly dependent on the very grace I was about to invoke, as much in need of a miracle as anyone in the pews. My hands, though steady in their actions, guided by years of ritual, trembled with an inner tremor as I performed the ancient rituals. The purificator, the wiping of the chalice, the profound genuflection. Each movement was steeped in centuries of tradition, a sacred dance passed down through generations, yet today it felt profoundly personal, an intimate, whispered conversation between my soul and the divine. The very air in the church, already thick with the spiritual tension I had felt during the homily, now grew heavier, almost viscous, making each breath a conscious effort. It was not a physical pressure but an ethereal one, a sense of a grand, invisible presence gathering, drawing closer, as if the very fabric of the sacred space was being drawn taut, ready to snap. Then, the clear, crystalline chime of the Sanctus bell. It cut through the heavy silence with an astonishing precision, a silver thread piercing the fabric of our shared anticipation. Ding, ding, ding. Each note hung in the air, vibrating, resonating, not just in the acoustic space of the church, but within the very chambers of our hearts, a physical tremor of both fear and hope. It was a sound that announced, without words, the imminence of the sacred, the approach of the Holy One. It signaled a boundary crossed, a threshold passed. The time for petition was over, the time for presence was at hand. The moment was approaching, the consecration, the transubstantiation, the very heart of our faith where the veil between heaven and earth is at its thinnest, shimmering, ready to be parted. I could feel a palpable shift in the church, a collective intake of breath from the congregation, a sudden collective stiffening in their postures, as if every person in every pew had unconsciously braced themselves for something extraordinary, something beyond the realm of ordinary human experience. It was as if the entire assembly held its breath, suspended in that sacred space between expectation and revelation, between the earthly and the divine. I could feel their collective gaze. It was not a curious gaze nor a critical one, but one born of desperate need and profound hope. A gaze that burned into my back, then met me as I turned. All eyes were on me, yes, but through me they were fixed on the simple wafer of bread I held. Still just bread, and the chalice of wine. Still just wine. They were watching, waiting, hoping for a sign that their prayers had not been in vain, that their trust had not been misplaced. What did they see? A tired priest, perhaps, standing before an altar, going through familiar motions, his face lined with the very doubts that afflicted them. But what did they feel? That was the crucial question. I hoped they felt what I felt, an almost unbearable closeness to the divine, a sense that God was not a distant, aloof creator, but an intimate, attentive Father, present in the very fabric of our lives, especially in our suffering, in our desperate pleas. The silence that followed the Sanctus bell was unlike any other silence I had ever known. It was pregnant, expectant, charged with 1,000 unspoken prayers, 1,000 unvoiced anxieties, 1,000 flickering embers of faith, each one waiting for a breath of divine wind to ignite it. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a canvas upon which the divine artist might choose to paint a truth more profound than any sermon could articulate. I stood before the altar, my hands hovering over the gifts, my heart beating a rhythm that seemed to echo the silent pulse of the entire congregation, a synchronized throb of human longing. I felt utterly inadequate, a mere vessel of clay, yet also profoundly privileged, to be the instrument in this moment, poised on the brink of the ineffable. The bread and wine awaited their transformation. The parish awaited their miracle. And I, the priest, awaited whatever God, in His infinite mercy, chose to reveal. The scale I knew was no longer merely poised, it was in the act of tipping. The scale I knew was no longer merely poised, it was in the act of tipping. With a deep, measured breath, a silent invocation for strength and grace, I reached for the paten. The host, a simple, unassuming disk of unleavened bread, rested lightly upon it. In that moment, the weight in my hands felt immense, not of its physical mass, but of the sacred mystery it embodied, and the countless prayers, hopes, and sorrows of the congregation gathered before me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull drumbeat in the profound silence that had descended upon the church, a silence now denser, more expectant than any I had ever known. Every fiber of my being, every neuron in my mind, was acutely aware of the Miller family in the front pew. Their bowed heads and clasped hands, a tableau of desperate, aching faith. I could feel their collective gaze, not just theirs, but that of every soul present, converging on me, on this moment, on the simple element soon to be transformed. My fingers, calloused from years of ministry, trembled ever so slightly as I lifted the paten, raising the sacred host before the hushed assembly. The altar, usually a familiar landscape of linen and polished brass, seemed to dissolve, replaced by a sense of standing on hallowed ground, on the very threshold of the divine. The stained glass windows, typically vibrant with the morning sun, now appeared to hold their breath, their colors muted, as if waiting. The very air, thick with unspoken pleas and a silent spiritual tension, seemed to shimmer, charged with an invisible energy. This was not a performance, it was an act of profound surrender, a priest offering himself as a conduit for the ineffable. "Take this, all of you, and eat of it," my voice began, a little hoarse yet firm, the ancient hallowed words echoing in the vaulted ceiling. "For this is my body, which will be given up for you." As the final syllable of "you" faded into the profound quiet, it began, not with a sudden flash or an explosive burst, but as a subtle interior warmth, a gentle thrumming that resonated deep within my chest, beneath my vestments, a quiet vibration that felt utterly distinct from my own racing pulse. It was as if the very air around the host I held had thickened, becoming imbued with an unseen benevolent energy. Then it became visible. A light, brilliant and golden, yet utterly soft, began to emanate, not from any external source, not a window, not a lamp, but from the Eucharist itself, from the simple white disk resting on the paten in my uplifted hands. It was not a reflection. This was a source, an incandescent glow that pulsed with an undeniable, profound warmth and the very essence of life. It began subtly, a faint, ethereal halo, then quickly intensified, expanding outward, a gentle wave of liquid gold that diffused through the sanctuary. Gasps rippled through the pews, not of fear, but of sheer, unadulterated wonder. They were soft, collective intakes of breath, a recognition of something extraordinary, something holy, unfolding before their very eyes. I saw it on their faces, illuminated by this new, wondrous light, eyes wide with awe, some moist with tears that had sprung unbidden, mouths slightly agape in silent testimony. Old Mrs. Gable's rosary, clutched so tightly moments before, now seemed to glow with a faint, reflected sheen. The grim determination on the faces of the Knights of Columbus melted into expressions of bewildered reverence. The light was unlike any earthly light I had ever witnessed. It did not blind, it clarified. It did not cast sharp shadows. Rather, it softened every edge, imbued every corner of the church with a luminous presence. The dusty motes that danced in the air, usually invisible, now shimmered like microscopic stars, caught in the golden current. The intricate carvings on the altar, the worn grain of the pews, the very dust on the kneelers, all were bathed in this radiant glow, appearing not merely illuminated, but transformed, as if seen for the first time through the eyes of heaven. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a palpable holiness, carrying a scent not of incense, but of purity, of grace, of an unspoken promise fulfilled. And within it, within this radiant living light, I felt it, a peace that surpassed all understanding. It was not merely the absence of anxiety, but an active, permeating tranquility that settled deep within my soul, silencing the clamor of my doubts, soothing the ache of my apprehension. The weight of inadequacy I had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by an awareness of being utterly held, utterly enveloped, by an infinite tenderness. My hands, still holding the Eucharist aloft, no longer trembled from human fear, but from the sheer overwhelming proximity to the divine. This was no longer a ritual, no longer a symbolic reenactment. This was the very presence of God, absolute and overwhelming, made manifest. The veil between heaven and earth, which the liturgy proclaimed to be thin at this sacred moment, was not merely thin, it was momentarily parted, torn open by an act of immeasurable grace. I was not just a priest performing a duty, I was a witness at the very throne of God. A mortal granted a glimpse into the heart of the Creator. My knees nearly buckled beneath me, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of this divine encounter. It was a humility so profound it threatened to dissolve me into nothingness, yet paradoxically it filled me with a sense of being more fully alive, more utterly present than I had ever been. Every theological treatise I had ever read, every sermon I had ever delivered, every quiet moment of prayer in my life, converged into this single, luminous instant. This was the truth of the Incarnation, the reality of the real presence, unfolding not as doctrine, but as radiant, undeniable experience. The golden light pulsated, not like a flicker, but with a deep rhythmic beat, as if the very heart of God was throbbing in our midst. It was warm, yet not hot, vibrant, yet deeply soothing. It permeated every particle of the sanctuary, dissolving the shadows, not with brightness, but with a profound, living luminosity that seemed to whisper promises of hope, of healing, of eternal love. My vision seemed to deepen, my perception to sharpen, yet all I could truly focus on was the glorious source, the small white host, now transformed into a beacon of divine love. I stood there, a simple vessel, overwhelmed, yet profoundly privileged, in the radiating heart of the world's most impossible, most glorious miracle. I could feel tears streaming down my face, unheeded, as I bore witness to the light of the world, made visible for all to see. The tears still streamed, unheeded, carving warm paths down my cheeks, but they were no longer tears of empathetic sorrow, nor even entirely of awe for the sheer, overwhelming presence of the divine. Now, a new emotion began to bloom within my chest, something akin to a joyful terror, an absolute, unshakable certainty that the very fabric of reality was being rewoven before my very eyes. The golden light, which had hitherto diffused softly throughout the sanctuary, now began to coalesce, to gather itself with an almost conscious intent. It pulsed, no longer with a general radiance, but with a focused, deliberate intensity, drawing itself inward, concentrating its glorious energy. I watched, mesmerized, my hands still trembling slightly as I held the luminous host, as this intensified light narrowed into a breathtakingly beautiful, vibrant beam. It was not a laser, stark and piercing, but rather a stream of liquid gold, shimmering with an inner life, like light spun from the very breath of God. And then, with a slow, deliberate grace that defied all earthly physics, this beam of pure, living light stretched forth from the Blessed Sacrament in my unworthy hands, traversing the sacred space of the altar, crossing the few feet of polished floor, and extending directly, unerringly to the very front pew. There, it found its destination, Lily Miller. The golden light, gentle as a mother's touch, yet overwhelmingly powerful, enveloped her in its warm embrace. It settled around her tiny, frail form like a living shroud, a cocoon spun from grace. The air around her seemed to shimmer, to hum with an unheard melody. And then, in the profound, aching silence that had fallen upon our congregation, a silence so deep you could almost hear the collective heartbeat of every soul present, the small, rhythmic beep, beep, beep that had been the constant, unwelcome soundtrack to Lily's suffering, ceased, abruptly, completely. The sudden absence of that sterile mechanical sound was more shocking than any explosion. It left a void, an emptiness that was instantly filled not with anxiety, but with an almost deafening quiet, a sacred stillness that vibrated with expectation. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes, still stinging from the unheeded tears, fixed upon Lily. The change was not gradual, it was instantaneous, breathtaking. The parchment-like pallor of her skin, which had been the haunting sign of her long battle, began to melt away, replaced by something I hadn't seen in over a year, a healthy, rosy blush. It bloomed across her cheeks, a delicate, vibrant hue that spoke of life, of blood flowing freely, of vitality surging anew. The fine, brittle hair that clung to her scalp seemed to thicken, to take on a soft sheen. Her lips, once cracked and pale, now held a hint of natural color. Then, she stirred. Not with the shallow, pained lethargy that had defined her movements for so long, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. No, this was different. This was the simple, fluid, utterly natural motion of a healthy child awakening from a deep slumber. Her small body shifted, her shoulders relaxing, her head lifting slightly, no longer burdened by the immense weight of illness. A soft sigh escaped her lips, a sound of peace, not pain. And then, her eyes. Oh, her eyes. They had been dull, clouded with a weariness that belied her tender age, often unfocused, lost in the haze of her suffering. Now they opened wide, and they were magnificent. They were vibrant, clear, the color of the deepest summer sky, sparkling with an intelligence and curiosity that had been long absent. They were the eyes of a child, fully present, fully alive, seeing the world anew. With a movement so casual, so completely devoid of the usual discomfort or carefulness that had surrounded her medical apparatus, Lily reached a small hand to her arm. A slender tube, a lifeline of sorts that had delivered medication and sustenance for months, was attached there. She detached it, not with the wince or struggle I'd seen so often, but with the simple, dismissive gesture of someone flicking away a piece of lint. It fell to the pew, an inert, suddenly irrelevant thing. She turned her head, her gaze shifting from the radiant light that still enveloped her, to her parents, who were frozen in a tableau of disbelief and burgeoning hope. Mark and Sarah, their faces etched with the lingering shadows of a year-long vigil, looked at their daughter as if she were a ghost, or an angel. Their hands, still clasped in prayer over her frail form, now trembled with an entirely different kind of tremor. And then, she spoke. Her voice, which had been a whisper, weak and hoarse, for so long, now rang out with an impossible clarity, a strength that filled the hushed sanctuary, cutting through the profound silence with the suddenness of a trumpet blast. "Mommy!" she said, her voice impossibly clear, utterly strong, and imbued with an uncomplicated joyful demand. "I'm hungry." Those simple words, "Mommy, I'm hungry." They were not a theological declaration, not a hymn of praise, not a profound utterance about the nature of God. They were the most human, the most ordinary, the most living words imaginable. They were the sound of life, reclaimed. They were the sound of a miracle, made flesh. Mark and Sarah simultaneously gasped, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock, terror, and a dawning, incandescent joy. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob that was half agony, half ecstasy. Mark, whose face had been a mask of stoic despair for so long, suddenly broke. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in an overwhelming surrender to grace, and he buried his face in his trembling hands, great, racking sobs shaking his entire body. These were not tears of sorrow, but a deluge of release, a profound eruption of gratitude that had found its impossible, undeniable outlet. The congregation, which had held its breath, now exhaled as one. A ripple of gasps, then murmurs, then choked sobs, began to spread through the pews. It wasn't a clamor but a release, a shared communal outpouring of stunned wonder, of a hope so long deferred now made brilliantly real. I stood at the altar, the golden light still pulsating from the host in my hands, tears of indescribable joy now mingling with the sacred oil of anointing on my face. I was not a priest performing a ritual. I was a man, a witness, utterly humbled and eternally grateful, standing in the very heart of God's manifest miraculous love. The impossible contradiction that had haunted our Mass, the palpable tension between human suffering and divine silence, had just been resolved not by human reason, but by an act of pure, unadulterated grace. The golden light, though it eventually softened and receded, left an indelible brilliance in its wake. The Mass concluded not with a formal dismissal, with the usual blessings and directives, but with an eruption of joyous, tearful praise that echoed through the hallowed space. No one moved to leave. Instead, people rose from their pews, not in haste, but as if drawn by an invisible current towards the front, towards Lily, towards Mark and Sarah, who now clung to their daughter, their faces streaked with tears, a mixture of shock, relief, and profound, unutterable gratitude. The very air in the church thrummed with a different kind of energy, no longer heavy with grief, but vibrant with a palpable spiritual joy. It was a holy chaos, a spontaneous liturgy of thanksgiving that felt more authentic than any prescribed ritual. My initial thought, hours before, had been to call the authorities, to intervene against what I perceived as reckless desperation. But now, that impossible contradiction had been resolved not by human law, not by my cautious adherence to protocol, but by divine mercy. By an act of love so overwhelming it defied all earthly logic. My fear of parental neglect, of a desperate gamble gone wrong, had been transformed into an undeniable testament to parental faith. A faith so absolute it had quite literally moved heaven to earth. Mark and Sarah, in their deepest suffering, had laid their last, most precious hope at God's feet, and He had answered in a way none of us could have ever dared to imagine. In the days and weeks that followed, the little town buzzed with a quiet, reverent wonder. Lily Miller, who had been on the precipice of death, her body a fragile vessel against a relentless storm, was now bursting with life. Her doctors, specialists from across the region who had followed her case for a year, confirmed what we had all seen with our own eyes. There was no medical explanation. Her bone marrow was healthy, her blood counts normal, every trace of the aggressive leukemia vanished. Completely, inexplicably, miraculously. Her case became a beacon, a story whispered in hushed tones, then spoken aloud with growing confidence, not just in our parish, but far beyond the confines of our small community. Hospitals called, researchers probed, but the answer remained steadfast. God's grace. Our parish, once wounded by doubt, burdened by the silent question of why a loving God would permit such suffering, was revitalized with a faith so profound it was tangible. The once somber atmosphere during Mass was replaced by an almost giddy sense of wonder, a hushed reverence mingled with undeniable joy. The daily rosary group swelled. The offertory donations reflected a generosity born of gratitude, and the faces in the pews shone with an inner light, a reflection of the grace that had touched us all. People spoke openly of God's presence, not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing reality they had witnessed with their very own senses. Funerals, once tinged with despair, now always included a hopeful mention of Lily, a reminder that even in death, life, and the promise of resurrection held sway. For me, the change was equally profound. I no longer look upon suffering, either my own or that of my flock, as a sign of God's absence, or as a test of endurance designed to break us. I now know from what I witnessed with my own eyes, from the gold light that emanated from the host, from Lily's vibrant, joyful face, that it is often in our most desperate hour, at the very edge of the abyss, that God chooses to remind us that He is not silent at all. He is present intimately and actively, most especially in the Blessed Sacrament, waiting, always waiting, to turn our deepest sorrows into His most glorious miracles. It is there, in the simple, sacred elements of bread and wine, that heaven truly touches earth, transforming not just substances, but lives, and in doing so reveals the boundless, tender heart of God. And I, His unworthy servant, will carry that truth, that light in my soul until my dying breath.